I found his name, I called him up, and he said, yes, I'd be happy to do an interview. And I went along there and I said to him, look, I'm very interested in this battle because my father was killed in it. And he gave what I thought was a magnificent response. He didn't say, I was only obeying orders. He didn't say, well, he was the enemy, you know, we had to do that. All he said was, many brave young men were killed in this battle.
This is The Storytellers, where we speak to long-standing journalists at The Times and The Sunday Times and ask them for 3 career-defining stories. It's a huge pleasure today to welcome Michael Binyon. He's had an over 3-decade career with The Times as a leader writer, as a foreign correspondent and as a diplomatic editor. Michael Binyon, welcome to the show. Thanks for being with us. I'm sure you struggled to pick your 3 stories with a career so long at The Times, but we'll go to your first one. And this is the story that made you. You'd been a reporter on the foreign desk, the Times foreign desk, for 17 odd years when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. Tell me about this as your first choice.
Well, that was fascinating because I'd been a correspondent in Bonn when Germany was divided, and of course I'd crossed the Berlin Wall many times to go over to East Germany and report what was going on then. Then after Germany, I was based in Washington, then back in Brussels, and then while I was in Brussels, I got a sudden call in the evening from the foreign desk who said, can you believe it, the Berlin Wall has been opened, how quickly can you get there? So I said, well, I can get the very first flight and I'll be there about 7:30 in the morning tomorrow. They said, yes, we want you to go to West Berlin and tell us what on earth is happening. So I flew straight out, I got a taxi and I just said, the wall, right now. And we zoomed off to the wall. And there, I couldn't believe what I saw, having seen this wall when it was just it's quite a tall wall, very big and pretty menacing, and there's a blank concrete facade. Well, blank on the eastern side, of course, covered in graffiti on the west. And there were people dancing on the top of it and sort of cheering and laughing, and I thought, what on earth is happening? Well, I knew that the wall was no longer the barrier that it had meant to be. And some Germans dancing on the top saw me and said, come up. And they helped me up. It's quite high up. I mean, it really is quite a way up. And they pulled me up. I remember I lost my house keys. I never found them again. And there I saw all the people on the other side, the East German Stasi guards, just standing around wondering what was going on. No, not doing anything. And that same day, people started streaming across. They'd come across first on the Friday, and I was there on Saturday, and then the big event was on Sunday morning, where they were opening a new crossing point, and the 2 mayors of East and West Berlin were going to meet, shake hands, and East Germans would be allowed, with a sort of quick, just a look at their identity cards, to stream out into West Berlin. And that's what they did, and it was absolutely fascinating.
We should remind ourselves that in those days there was no social media. So as a journalist, you're turning up to a scene where you don't know what to expect, and you've expressed your shock at what you saw. I wonder whether that's a bit of a shame now that, you know, journalists, unless it's a rare instance when they happen to be caught in a story as it's happening, are often sent to cover a story where they're, in their mind's eye, they've got an idea of what to expect. You lose that shock factor.
Yes, I had no idea what was going to happen. It really was extraordinary, and it was one of the few times I've thought, this is history happening all around me. This really is a turning point, as indeed it proved to be. And I also felt there's almost nothing I can say that can match what the television pictures will show, because they showed crowds, happy crowds, streaming across, the excitement, the amazing effect of what people had never thought would happen. I remember a few little details that stood out. For example, the bit where they came across, sort of in central Berlin, that happened to be in the British sector. West Berlin was still essentially governed by the Four-Power Agreement, and it was the same as in 1945. So the central bit was under British military control. Of course, they didn't actually exercise authority, but technically it was British area. So the British Army thought that they would get in on the act by setting up a kind of welcoming tent, and they had this scruffy old khaki tent which they'd set up just outside the new crossing point with an old urn of tea and cups for the refugees coming across, or no, they're not refugees, the excited East Berliners. And they came rushing across, they got their greetings money, 100 marks each, and what they wanted to do was rush off to the department stores and buy bananas and things they'd never seen.
Greetings money, just tell us about that.
Yes, the West German government, to welcome them all, the West Berlin government, said that each person coming across would be given 100 marks to spend, which is a very clever way of saying, come and look what we've got. And, you know, it was a sort of propaganda.
How much was that in today's
money? Well,
money?
100 marks was...
Trying to remember the marks conversion.
Yeah, those days, that was about 45 quid. I mean, that was not bad. You know, just something, enough to buy lots of bananas or whatever they wanted. And, of course, they came... not a single one stopped at the British tent where they were being offered cups of tea. The squaddies were saying, welcome, willkommen, willkommen. They rushed past. And it went on all day, and lots of excited East Berliners just completely lost in West Berlin, because on their maps it was just a blank spot. Their maps never showed West Berlin. They had no idea where they were, this big sort of white spot on their maps. And so they had no idea where the streets were, what was going on, and they walked around with wide eyes looking at it all.
What do you think of the quality of war reporting overall at the moment? And I ask this because there is a feeling that journalists sent to cover conflicts are getting younger and have less experience behind them, maybe know less about the area that they're covering in terms of geographical context, in terms of its history. What do you think about that? You have, you know, witnessed and written up so many monumental international events and moments. What do you think about whether it's being saturated, whether it's not being respected enough, perhaps?
Well, it's always useful to have some background. I was lucky in Berlin because, as I said, I'd been a correspondent and I'd seen Berlin when it was still divided, and I knew what it was like and where we were before. Going to wars, yes, you need to read up on the background. I don't think it matters that you don't have a lot of experience, as long as you're pretty faithful to what you see and what you report. I mean, for example, I covered the 1973 Arab-Israeli war, and I was on the Egyptian side, and I crossed the canal with the Egyptian troops, not during the fighting, but after the ceasefire, which was pretty chaotic, I have to say. And I went out into the Sinai Desert, and I went to the headquarters of the Egyptian army to meet their general, General Shazali. And, I mean, I'd never done that before, but you just have to report what you see and what's happening. So as long as you are faithful to what you see, I don't think it matters if you come with wide-eyed, you know, innocent ingenuity, I mean, not seen this before. You just need to be sensitive to where you are.
Let's talk about the story that nearly broke you. It's 3 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's the Reykjavik summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And it was a summit attempting to wholeheartedly agree between those two great nations and beyond, the elimination of nuclear weapons. It was a very big deal. Why then is this the story that nearly broke you?
Well, it nearly broke me because it was totally inaccurate, and I have to say, not my fault. It was the fault of the clock. It was the fact...
What happened then?
Well, it was because Iceland is I think it's 1 or possibly 2 hours behind London. So the final press conference on the final day was being given by George Shultz, the US Secretary of State, and I'd come over with the American White House correspondents as I was based in Washington. So I was given a desk with a hotline phone back to my Washington office. This was the day before mobiles. You couldn't just call anywhere. There was no connection to the London office. So the arrangement was that I would be able to phone back to Washington just the quick outline of what Shultz said about the result of the conference, because there'd been 2 days of Reagan talking to Gorbachev, and we had no idea how it had gone. We didn't know whether they'd agreed or not agreed or what had happened.
And this was a huge story. This was about the future of nuclear weapons.
Absolutely, yes. And it was quite clear that, you know, Reagan was sort of ready to say, let's get rid of all nuclear weapons. Thatcher was absolutely appalled, by the way. But, well, that was what he had hoped to do. But I was there, and Schultz came in, and it was 7:30, I think, Reykjavik time. So it was absolutely on deadline in London. And I'd got the famous, you know, order back to London, hold the front page. They knew it was going to be front page. So ready for the story. And I'd said, I'll just give a quick call to Washington and they'll relay back to you what's happened. So in comes Schultz, and he says, a world without nuclear weapons. A summit that ends on smiles and a handshake. The end of the Cold War is in sight. This was an amazing prospect. And I quickly phoned back to Washington and said, Schultz talks about smiles and handshake, a world without nuclear weapons, he outlines. And he talks about, you know, a vision of the end of the Cold War. And then he went on talking, and he went on like this for about 2 or 3 minutes. And then he suddenly said, unfortunately, it was not to be. Unfortunately, we did not agree. The summit collapsed. And I quickly called up Washington. It's collapsed. Stop, stop, stop. Tell them, no, it ended in failure. They said, too late. It's gone. Too late. And I said, just 5 minutes. No, the front page is gone. So the first edition had summit ends on smiles and handshake. Schultz outlines a world without nuclear weapons.
Great news. Great news,
Great
everyone.
news. Front headline splash. And the second edition said, summit collapses in failure and recriminations. The two sides don't agree. Or it couldn't be more different. But it was just the clock. Just
Who
those
starts a
vital
speech like that? Who starts a speech like that with all their wishes?
Well, I know.
And then says, but no.
Well, Schultz was talking mostly to the American press. The American press had 4 or 5 hours in hand before deadline. Only a few Europeans, Washington-based ones, who knew they were right on newspaper deadline, they couldn't afford this sort of indulgent rhetoric to start with. They needed the result now, but we didn't get it, and that cost us dearly.
What did the editor say to you?
Oh, it didn't. I mean, he knew it wasn't my fault. I think I didn't get reprimanded, but I did feel fairly foolish for sending over something that turned out to be the absolute opposite of what really happened.
And were there lessons from that for you? There really wasn't much you could do about it apart from...
No, not much. The lesson is always report east of Greenwich. If you're reporting from Moscow, say, you've got 3 hours in hand. If you're reporting from Europe, you've got an hour or two. If you're reporting from Washington, you've always got the problem. You've got to send the story over by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to catch the first edition. So you always have to think, now, will this story last for the rest of the day? Or will I have to update it later on? And if you know you're going to have to update it, you have to word it in such a way that it doesn't look stupid the next day.
So much to consider. Let's talk about your last story, and this is the one that stayed with you. It's an interview that you did with Waffen-SS General Heinz Harmel. He was the German commander in charge of the Battle of Arnhem in 1944. And he was the man responsible for the death of your father.
Yes, he was indeed.
Firstly, tell me what happened to your father.
My father was one of the parachutists, many Royal Engineers, a huge number who descended on Arnhem with Montgomery's plan to get to Berlin in a single quick thrust. The idea was to drop lots of parachutists behind the German lines, capture all the bridges across the Rhine, hold the bridges, while the British Army caught up with them, relieved them, and then in a quick, narrow thrust down to Berlin, got there before the Russians.
Yeah, and this is post-Normandy, and this
Yes.
is one of the final
Yes,
stages of the war.
That's right.
Yeah.
Britain, well, the Allies were on a winning streak, the Germans were in retreat, but what they didn't know, except for one intelligence agent who reported it, and it's well documented in that film, A Bridge Too Far, what they didn't know was that there were 2 German panzer divisions resting in the woods, concealed in the area of Arnhem. So they dropped all these parachutists, and they dropped them right on top of the Germans. They captured the bridge, several bridges, and they captured quite a lot of territory. The Dutch, of course, rejoiced and helped them, but they couldn't hold on to them because straight away the German troops, they were rested, they came out, and they said, what on earth is going on here? And one of the people who said exactly that was the man I interviewed, General Heinz Harmel. He was the one who then held the bridge, the other end. The British had got one end of this. It was the final bridge, the bridge too far, as they say, the one over the main branch of the Rhine, which was absolutely essential if the British troops were going to advance east into Berlin. But he held onto the bridge, and of course there was no way of reinforcing them. The British troops couldn't catch up with them. My father was caught not on the bridge itself, but in a little salient where gradually the Germans squeezed them till they were really, really in a bit of land not more than half a mile across. And he went out and he was trying to deal with a German tank, and it got him first. And they never found the body. It was just blown to bits, apparently.
Goodness me.
But Heinz Harmel was the overall commander, and he was still alive 40 years later, 1984. I found his name, I called him up and he said, yes, I'd be happy to do an interview. And I went along there and I said to him, look, I'm very interested in this battle because my father was killed in it. And he gave what I thought was a magnificent response. He didn't say, I was only obeying orders. He didn't say, well, he was the enemy, you know, we had to do that. All he said was, many brave young men were killed in this battle, with the implication being on both sides, which of course was true. And he was a professional soldier. This Waffen-SS is a bit misleading. He wasn't SS, he wasn't a butcher. He wasn't the people who guarded the camps. He was in the elite, the equivalent of the SAS, the elite German army force. Pretty good soldier, full-scale general at the age of 38, and a fascinating man to talk to. Quite a modest fellow, quite proud of his soldiering, didn't really agree with the overall Third Reich. He was never a Nazi, but he was just a good old-fashioned professional and talked about the whole of the battle and how the Germans had been amazed at all these British parachutists suddenly descending from the sky and what to do about it. And it was just an eyewitness account from the other side of what actually happened.
You seem quite sort of pragmatic about going to meet him and about finding out his story.
Yeah.
But of course this is intensely personal to you.
Yes.
Your mum was pregnant with you when your dad died, so you grew up never knowing your dad.
No.
Probably living with the legend more than you know, of course, more than any personal memories of him. Did you remain pragmatic throughout the process of interviewing him, or were there any moments where it struck a little deeper, or this story was much more important than any other story you'd written? How did you personally connect with it?
I suppose I was ready to talk to him. Throughout my childhood, as I would say, I'd never known my father, so it was a sort of a legend, as it were. I mean, I'd heard about him. My mother remarried when I was 8, so I had a sort of another family, as it were. But yes, he'd always been a person, you know, that we'd revered and we remembered, but I never remembered him. So there wasn't a personal memory. Of course, there was the sort of feeling, well, it was my father, you know, and if it hadn't been for him, I wouldn't have been here, of course. The only emotional moment I found was when I actually went to the bridge itself the day before I interviewed him. And I went there, and it was just a normal bridge, still the same bridge, buses and cars and everything going on. And I just wept when I was there at the bridge, thinking about it. But when I met him, no, it was much more just a conversation, because he turned out to be a pretty decent guy. I mean, sort of, you know, he was on the other side, and that's how it was. And interestingly, the man who was actually the commander on the other end of the bridge, the British commander, General Frost, he also, after the war, became quite a close friend of Hamel. They were both generals. They both had worked with each other. Well, not worked, but and Hamel had allowed a 1-hour ceasefire for people to take their dead off the bridge, for the British, to collect their dead and their wounded. And then they started again. I asked him, you started the whole fighting again after, you know, an hour's ceasefire. What was your feeling? And he said, well, we had a job to do, and we hadn't done it. So we had to complete the job, which was to get the British off the bridge, which he did.
Did you want him to apologise for the death of your father?
Not really. I mean, he was in charge of the overall operation, but he hadn't personally killed my father. You know, it was war, and that's how it is. And it would have been a rather false apology if he'd said, well, I'm awful. He sort of suggested, you know, war is a terrible thing, but that's how it goes.
And just looking back on, you know, and having this sort of heroic father, the legend, as we're calling him, has that not having that presence there in your life and sort of living with that legend, someone who was killed overseas serving their country, is there any parallel in your writing career? Does any of that come into your writing, do you think, having lost a parent?
Lost people in battle and in combat. Well, you sort of understand the toll it takes on their family, particularly their loved ones. I mean, their wives or their, not in my case, because I was not even born, but sometimes their children or all the others. And so one thinks in modern wars exactly the cost of war. And you think of Ukraine, you know, the cost of all these usually young ones who are sent to the front, cannon fodder. And you think, well, we talk about you know, 100,000 or 200,000 Russian casualties, of course Ukrainian casualties as well, Russian casualties, where frankly they're just thrown into the battle line and that's it. And you think, well, great, you know, the Ukrainians have killed all this many. And I don't think that. I think I know Russians, I lived in Russia, and I think of lots of mothers who've lost their sons. And I feel very, very sad about it. And similarly, obviously, Ukrainians, they're defending their country. But again, young people in the prime of their life are being killed. And it does make you realize that war has a terrible cost.
Michael Binyon, it's been fascinating speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.